we have the ethical and moral duty to pressure our athletes to get their bodies healthy. Make sure that we are taking athletes seriously when they tell us that they are hurt. You could say, Dan, you're being hypocritical, because it technically is, because if I was saying athlete safety is the number one priority, then we wouldn't do some of the things that we're doing because they're not actually safe. Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of the Cheer Biz podcast. I'm your host, Dan Cotton, and today we are going to be diving into the New York Times Magazine's article on all-star cheerleading, implications of private equity and Varsity All Star's involvement in the sport over the past decades and how that impacts us, as well as my opinion. Now, I'll be honest, this is my second time recording this episode, and not because there were any issues with the first one. I didn't feel like it was the greatest episode, and I was supposed to release it on Saturday, but I kind of rushed through it, and I just don't think that I talked about it the way I wanted to. I tried a different format, and I wanted to be a little bit more brief and not wander around as much in the conversation and be a little bit more specific. So I wanted to kind of redo it and take another stab at it. So here it is. Now, this article came out on October 22nd of 2024. If you're watching this on video, you obviously see my computer is in front of me. That is actually so I can reference the article, reference some notes and some other things I have as we go through this. And the article opened up with a story, and it told the story of Nikki Jennings, who had started her cheer career when she was 4 and grew up in all-star cheerleading and had experience with some high-profile coaches in the cheer industry, and then later went on to graduate. And before she graduated, competed at the Cheerleading Worlds and became a little bit of a cheerlebrity before going to University of Hawaii, where she cheered, and Mike Baker was the coach. Talked through her journey with multiple concussions and tough coaching and the way coaches kind of treated her during injuries and her perspective on those things. There were a number of assertions that she made involving her all-star cheer career and her collegiate career as a cheerleader, to include her injuries that she had and then kind of what happened after she left cheer and found that she was, in her opinion, harmed by her experience within cheerleading. I kind of want to dive into a couple things with that story. First off, my heart breaks for her. I think that it is absolutely abhorrent that anyone would leave the sport feeling that way. I don't want any athlete that I've ever coached to feel the way she's felt about her coaches. Now, am I a tough coach? Yes. Do I want my athletes to look back and say, Dan was tough? Yeah, I do. I actually do want them to say Dan was a tough coach, but I also want them to know that I was tough, but I was fair, and I was tough, but I loved them unconditionally. Specifically, I loved them despite their potential performance on a mat. And I tell my coaches this, I tell my athletes this, that you are much more than a skill to me. Now, that I have a role as your coach to hold you accountable for the skills that you perform in a routine, but my care and concern for you as a human being, my investment in you as a human being goes far beyond any skill. I care about you as a person, and you are not just a number. You are not just a skill to me. And so I have those conversations with my athletes. I also definitely know the challenge of battling through injury. I battled through injuries myself as a college athlete. And I think that there is a high expectation on athletes, and it comes from four different avenues is really where I think that you see a lot of the pressures come from, especially in regard to our younger athletes participating in the sport. One is there's pressure from their coaches. Absolutely, there is pressure from coaches to perform, to push, to get back in the game, to get back out into practices. There's absolutely pressure. And that is unavoidable. It exists in every sport that involves winning being contingent on your performance. Every coach is going to be applying pressure to athletes, whether they're a basketball player, a swimmer, a football player. And it's not even just because there is pressure does not mean it is a bad thing. It can be conducted in a bad way. So it all really matters how that pressure is executed. So for instance, I have had athletes who have injured themselves. I had one of my athletes, she now coaches for me. She tore her ACL her first year on my world's team. And it was actually her second ACL tear. And it was devastating for her. I was devastated for her. And she was dead set that she was going to compete with the team at Worlds. I put a lot, air quotes, of pressure on her to get healthy. And I think that is ultimately the focus. Like, hey, I'm going to pressure you to do your therapy. If this is your goal, if you want to compete with your team, then you need to go to physical therapy. You need to do your exercises. You need to be icing. You need to be doing all of the things that are going to get your body healthy faster. So is there pressure to get them better and get in the game? Yeah, there is. I think there always is going to be from a coach. As a coach, though, we have the ethical and moral duty to pressure our athletes to get their bodies healthy, as opposed to get back in the routine at the expense of your body. I tell my athletes all the time when they have injuries or things going on, and they're like, hey, I really need to be in for showcase, or I really need to be in for this performance. And I say, I want you in too. I want you in Worlds too. But I also want you to be able to pick up your kids someday. I also want you to be able to compete next year. I also want you to be able to compete at the end of the season. And so those are things that I say to athletes, and any athlete that I've coached that's ever been injured has heard me say some semblance of that to them. I know it's really stressful right now, and I know you really want to be in, and it feels like the end of the world, but this is a long season. It's a marathon, not a sprint. Let's get you healthy and get you back in the routine and get you back doing what you love to do. So number one is pressure from coaches. Number two is pressure from the athletes themselves. More often than not, I am having to pull the reins back on kids and say, you can't go back in the routine. No, you are injured. I had an athlete who unfortunately broke her finger on Thursday night, and we showcased on Saturday. Just an unfortunate issue. She broke her finger, jammed it doing a back handspring. And she was like, but are you sure I can't perform? And I was like, yes, I'm 100% sure you're not performing. And she didn't fight me very hard. But like, if I had really pushed her, would she have potentially tried? Yeah, I think she would have. She's that kind of athlete. And I never would have, but it's more often than not, I find myself having to pull the reins back and tell kids, hey, I need you to go see a doctor, or hey, I need you to sit this one out. Hey, we're not going to tumble today because I saw you roll your ankle. Right. So there is that balance there between the coach and the athlete. The next area of pressure is from their teammates. Their teammates, whether it is intentional or unintentional, put pressure on one another to perform, and they feel a duty to do their job when it comes to their teammates. And so they oftentimes will put pressure on one another to step up and perform and push through what may not be a visible injury. And lastly is pressure from parents. Parents absolutely put pressure on the athletes to push past an injury, to get back in the game. Now, it's not every parent, but there are parents that absolutely tell kids, suck it up, buttercup, get in there and do your job. And I have had to have conversations with parents and be like, hey, I really need you to take them to a doctor. I think they are more seriously injured than you may think. And so let's just at least have a medical professional check them out and see what's going on. Again, do I think in most of these circumstances that people have ill intentions? No, I do think anyone involved in the process can make an error. And oftentimes it doesn't come from, in my experience, again, are there bad actors out there? Yes, I'm sure there are. I worked in law enforcement for 15 years. There's bad people with bad intent. But many of the times what I find is it is people who just get focused on the wrong end goal. And if your ultimate end goal is winning at all costs, then that means winning at all costs, to include the cost of the athlete's physical or mental well-being. And if your athlete is, or if your motivation is athlete first, then that is going to oftentimes prevent you from going down that negative path. Now, again, it's still easy to get conflicted though. So it's not an easy road to hoe. And while I feel for her experience, and I think it's awful, and like I said, no one should have that experience, I think that it is easy as a coach, as an athlete, to find yourself there. I was an athlete who pushed through. I broke my hand before college nationals. It was like 4 or 5 weeks before. And I wore my cast for 2.5 weeks. And then I went to the doctor. I said, you cut this thing off or I'm cutting it off myself. My hand feels fine. Now, it didn't feel fine, but I was not going to miss my first college nationals. And I herniated discs in my back, and I continued to push and continue to compete every year. But the year I had a broken hand, I competed at nationals with a herniated disc in my lower back because it would herniate mid-season every single year. Have I had experiences from that? Yes, I have. I've had negative consequences because of that, and 8 years in the Army. But there are a lot like we make choices and those choices have consequences. I think one of the things that we can do to take better care of athletes physically is, one, have a return to play protocol within your gym, have rules and regulations in regard to, what do athletes have to do if they have some sort of an injury? What do they have to demonstrate before you're going to have them go back into a routine? I think we also need to be more proactive in pulling athletes out that are in obvious pain to have them sit and take that night. Like, yes, it sucks to have them take a night off, but also it's going to suck to have them out for the entire season. So we want to make sure that we are taking care of those athletes from that perspective. And then number 3 would be to make sure that we are taking athletes seriously when they tell us that they are hurt. The hardest things are concussions, back injuries, like Miss Jennings described, her hip injuries, like those things that you can't see. It's really rare for a coach to have a kid who like breaks their arm and has 2 broken bones in their forearm be like, get back in there. But it's a lot easier to get frustrated and exacerbated with a kid who has kind of an ongoing like pain, my back really hurts. It's just kind of constant. You can't do their job. And as someone who had debilitating back pain in college, like I know my teammates were frustrated with me because there were practices where I was like, I couldn't do it. But what they didn't see was there was literally a day in college I will never forget when I stood up from my couch and my back went out and it hit my sciatic nerve and I collapsed to the floor. And it took me an hour to crawl to my bed just to get into my bed. I was in so much pain. My teammates, I look fine. Like I don't have a bone sticking out. So it's really hard as a coach, as a teammate, as a parent to see your kid saying they're in pain, but there's nothing wrong. And then they go to the doctor and the doctor goes, well, a back strain. Like every single time I've herniated a disc in my lower back, I've been diagnosed with a back strain. That's the first thing they say. Oh, you pulled a muscle. Well, I can tell you I didn't pull a muscle. Now I know enough about my body now where I can just tell you what's going on, but that's because I know my back really well. We need to be better at that. The invisible injuries that are like visible in regards to pain and discomfort, but they're invisible in terms of to the naked eye, you cannot see them. And then encouraging athletes to see true medical professionals. Find the doctors in your area that are going to take it seriously, that are not just going to take your athlete. Because I unfortunately have seen this where athletes go in and to a doctor and they're like, oh, I'm a cheerleader. And the doctor, I've been with athletes at the doctor where the doctor is kind of initially dismissive and they're like, oh, well, you probably strained something. And I'm like, no, wait, sorry, hold on. They're a elite competitive cheerleader. So let me show you a video of what they do, right? And then I'm like, here's them doing an Arabian through to double full. And they're like, oh my gosh. And you're like, yeah, this is what they're doing. Okay, so can we take this seriously now? Now, that's happened less and less and less as cheerleading has grown in popularity. I see it less often. I myself have had doctors be dismissive of me when they find out that I'm a cheerleader. And so making sure that they go to doctors who do take it seriously, who are going to run through the progressions and make sure that that athlete is healthy, run them through physical biomechanical testing, get them imagery, get them MRIs. I get so frustrated because athletes will be like, oh, I went and my back's really hurting. So I went and got an x-ray and the doctor said, it's fine. I'm like, well, that's not telling us like 90% of the problems that tend to happen with a back. Yes, I've had kids come in and be like, I have a stress fracture, which again, it's an unseen injury. So taking those things seriously and getting athletes to medical professionals, true medical professionals who are going to take it seriously. One of my biggest pet peeves is, parents taking their kid to a chiropractor for a sprained ankle. And then they're like, oh, well, my chiropractor said I'm fine. And I'm like, well, that doesn't freaking mean anything. I don't really care. That was number one. That was how the article opened and that it ended similarly. It touched on two different situations regarding athlete injury and athlete treatment. Another one was in relation to another athlete whose name is slipping my head right now. It's later in the article where she talks about being shunned by her teammates after she had left the program. All I can say is that was not my experience in college. That has not been my experience with any of my teams. And I think we owe it to our athletes to not ever encourage that kind of behavior. Just because someone's no longer on the team does not mean they need to be shunned. I have even had athletes who've quit a team mid-season, and I've never told their teammates, hey, this athlete's dead to us. Never talk to them again. Like it's just not a good approach. These are human beings, and it's just a sport. And if they need to leave to do what's best for them and their body or their lifestyle, and they don't want to do it anymore, then that's okay. As long as people conduct themselves with integrity, I'm happy about that. And even if they don't, I'm still going to treat them well because they're still a human being. And going back to the really old adage, two wrongs doesn't make a right. The article goes into a lot more detail, and it really spent a lot of time talking about the involvement of private equity, Varsity All Star involvement in the sport, and the USASF involvement in the sport. Now, I've never had anyone from private equity on the podcast, although I do know a couple of people who are in the private equity sphere, and I can talk a little bit to that, but not too much. I have interviewed people from Varsity. If you've listened to my podcast for a long time, you've probably heard me say, I have never been in the room with Varsity people who are engaged in, kind of the cigar smoke filled lounge where they're like, it's that like James Bond villain kind of thing. And this article actually kind of makes some allegations that that's a little bit of Jeff Webb's mysterious nature. And that's how he kind of talked about in circles of cheer as being like I think they even referred to him as a dark Sith Lord at one point, which I think is pretty extreme. I'm not sure I fully agree with that, but that's my personal opinion. And you guys know I'm a business person. So although I certainly don't respect every decision that Varsity has made. I don't agree with it. I don't think they've all been good for the industry. And I'll talk about a few of them that were mentioned in the article. It's all comes down to conflicting interests, right? Like sometimes it is hard to align the goal of growing the sport with running a profitable business with taking care of athletes and putting athletes first and families first and keeping costs down. Like sometimes those things do not work in harmony with one another, and you have to find the best path forward. And people oftentimes are going to prioritize what their individual interest is. Now, I believe that we as an industry should always hold athlete safety and taking care of our athletes to be the highest priority, especially in the all-star cheerleading world, because we're dealing with young kids. And athletes being safe is very, very important. Now, again, though, I have to be honest, we are always playing a balancing game because life isn't safe. And if you're sitting here and I'm saying athlete safety should always be the number one priority, well, you could say, Dan, you're being hypocritical because it technically is. Because if I was saying athlete safety is the number one priority, then we wouldn't do some of the things that we're doing because they're not actually safe. They can be performed more safely, but it is inherently not truly safe to throw someone into the air, have them perform aerial acrobatic tricks, and then catch them with human beings. There just is risk in that. And if it is risky, it is not necessarily safe. So I just want to kind of touch on that you can have athlete safety be the number one be the priority. We want to make sure athletes are safe, but also within the context of what we do in this sport, which does have risk. I care about athlete safety very much, but I have athletes that get injured every single year. It is an inevitability, not a possibility. It is an inevitability that there will be injuries on a team, whether it could be very benign. It could be a bloody nose and a sprained ankle, but like those things are going to happen. We had an athlete break their hand or break their finger giving a high five during a relay race. Injuries will occur. So athlete safety is very important, but it sometimes it can be in conflict with other priorities. So I want to talk a little bit about some of the assertions in regard to the USASF's founding and the problematic nature of Jeff Webb campaigning against cheerleading being recognized as a sport. And I vividly remember when this happened. I was very much involved in the industry when it occurred. I remember when there were court proceedings, and a lot of us were really excited and like, okay, it's finally going to be recognized as a sport and it's going to make a difference. And to hear that the head of varsity went and testified that cheerleading is unequivocally not a sport, I know really made a lot of people unhappy, and to include myself. I cannot speak to someone's personal motivations. I can speak to my perspective of what it looked like in the moment. In the moment, what it looked like to me was that the motivation to say that would have been to maintain the ability to keep varsity having a large amount of control over the sport, as well as continue to offer the things that they offer to scholastic programs like their NCAA, UCA, USA summer cheer camps. Because if they are not a sport, then they have a lot more freedom to attend those events and have those events be part of the season. Whereas although football camp and basketball camp are things that occur, they are actually much less common than cheer camp is, in my experience. Like in our area, not every football team goes to football camp from high school, but there is not a single high school in the Portland metro area that doesn't go to cheer camp. Like they all go to camp. And whether it be a varsity camp or it be one of my camps with dream camps, they all go to a camp. I can certainly understand the concern of like, hey, this is a huge part of my business, and if it gets recognized as a sport, then the schools are going to step in. They're going to have restricted seasons, and they're not going to be able to participate as much, and then that's going to create some major problems. Now, I don't know that was his intent, and I'm not going to speak to his intent. I'm just going to say that was my perspective at the time, and I can logically, I could make that connection. My understanding is he's pivoted a little bit in his perspective and now is pushing for it to be recognized as an Olympic sport. And I also think being recognized as an Olympic sport could be really fantastic for the cheerleading community and cheerleading world. So I'm not against that. What I don't think, the article makes the claim that if it had been recognized as a sport, it would have reduced the probability of the injuries that Miss Jennings experienced in college. She would have had more support. She would have had better coaches and all of these other things. And I can tell you that I just, in my opinion, do not believe that is true. I don't believe that's true because, one, it wouldn't have impacted all-star cheerleading really in any way because it would have just been recognized as a sport from a scholastic perspective. And that doesn't impact what we do in all-star because we're private. I also don't think it would have changed anything from the high school perspective or the collegiate perspective, because most of the university athletes that I know have access to trainers, have access to doctors, have access to those things when they're a part of the cheerleading program. Most of the colleges I've seen have that. On top of that fact, I have athletes that have gone on to cheer at a number of colleges, which is where I'm getting some of my experience, as well as what my experience was when I was in college, as well as athletes who've gone on to cheer or to be a part of stunt programs, which at some universities is recognized as a sport, and gone on to be at acrobatics and tumbling programs, which at the universities that they're at is recognized as a provisional sport. And it has not reduced the amount of injuries that they get at all in comparison to cheerleading. It has not changed the style of skills that they are performing. It has not increased the quality of coaches. In fact, although some of my former athletes coach colleges now, which is super cool, for a period of time with acrobatics and tumbling, like they are recognized as a provisional sport, an NCAA sport, and the quality of coaching, like they're literally hiring people directly out of college. These are like 22-year-olds and they're being hired as head coaches because it's an emerging sport. So there are no other options. And like the certification process is negligible at best. So I just don't see how that would have made any sort of dramatic impact on the sport and the safety at a collegiate level. It's an easy claim to make, but I don't see the evidence of it other than there would have been more regulation, which I think can help, certainly, but I'm not sure we would have seen any rules really change. In my opinion, one of the most reckless things that we do as a sport within collegiate cheerleading is we make those athletes compete on dead mat. I think that performing the tumbling skills that we expect athletes to perform at a collegiate level, even though they aren't double foaling, is insane. And it is bad for your body. And I feel the same way about acrobatics and tumbling and stunt. And they all perform on dead mat. And they don't do it because it's safer. They do it because it is cheaper. It is easier to get universities to take on the program if they don't have to have a dedicated spring floor that doesn't come up and down. It's easy to start an acro program or a stunt program because you're able to say, look, all we need to do is buy $8,000 of mats that we can roll out anywhere, and bada boom, bada bing, we've got a program. And so it's like, wow, this is great. It meets Title IX, it satisfies some requirements, like sets some scholarship things up for NCAA. Like, this is great. That's not a safety decision. It absolutely is not. It is a 100% money decision. And to say that varsity is some horrendous money hungry entity, and that if we had just taken cheerleading and put it under the NCAA and they're not, I think is a stretch further than I am willing to go, because I can say a lot of the same things about decisions and actions that the NCAA has taken over years as well. Like, they've also made some questionable decisions in regard to safety and putting profits first and taking advantage of student athletes for financial gain. So I don't know that I buy that quite as much, but that's my opinion on the sport aspect of it. Now, the article goes into deep reference into the USASF and the varsity correlation. And I will just say a couple things on that. One, I think the industry is better because of the founding of the USASF. That's just it. I do think that the industry is better due to the founding of the USASF. I was in the industry before, and there was no unified rules in any way, shape, or form. It varied based off of event producer to event producer. You could do whatever you wanted, and the event producers could do whatever they wanted. So you could have an event producer that was like, yep, it's totally okay for third graders to throw back tuck basket tosses. Now, I'm not saying that existed, but I'm just saying they could have. And there was no governing body. There was no unity in any way, shape, or form. And when the USASF was founded and things started to fall under that framework, you saw change, and you saw rules being talked about. You saw the industry coming together. You started to see collaboration. You saw people having valuable conversations. And although safety didn't immediately improve, I think there were really good steps made, and decisions were being made more intentionally in regard to safety. And I think that although there have been hundreds of missteps along the way, because it's impossible to get anything right the first time. And that's not tongue in cheek. That is just factual. Very rarely is anyone just getting it right perfectly right off the bat. We've had a lot of learning steps. We are making a lot of adjustments over the years. I think it has overall had a positive impact on safety. And even if you think that the USASF made mistakes, if you look across the industry, at the biggest players in the game, between the NFHS, between NATIA, between USASF, between the Open, most of the things that are like hard, like very much illegal, not technical legalities, but like this is illegal, have been pretty consistent among them. And so you're seeing an overall improvement in the sport because people are starting to take safety seriously across the board. Do I think that it was right to have so much varsity influence on the USASF at the beginning? I absolutely don't. And I didn't like it from then, and I still don't like it now. I think it was a misstep. I think it was whatever the motivations were of founding it, I think that was a misstep. To have varsity employees be key people on the board, I think that was a problem. And I don't think that it was a good move. And I think that it definitely caused some things to happen that could have been avoided and may have been avoided if there was other people at the helm running that. And it's just, I don't think it is a good look to ever have a for-profit entity deeply intertwined with a nonprofit entity that makes decisions that impact the for-profit entity's profits. Like, I just think that that creates a really messy look and was a mistake. I have been in the industry long enough. I actually worked for NCA before NCA was owned by Varsity. I'm pretty sure it was before. So I worked for NCA when NCA was an independent company. And then I think Varsity bought NCA and I still may have worked for it. I don't know. I don't know the exact timeline there. Even though it was talked about in the article, I don't remember it off the top of my head. So I worked for NCA at one point in time, and I enjoyed it. I think that there were a lot of good things that Varsity has done for the industry. I think that there were a lot of good things in regard to how it elevated the level of competition, how they elevated the level of delivery for customers, adding the production value, the staging, the lighting, those kind of things. I think that's really cool. Now, do I think it needed to be at every event? No. I have been in the industry long enough where when I first was participating in All Star Cheer, we had a bunch of independent event producers locally. We would have events like a local convention center, like a small venue with maybe 50 teams. And that was the weekend. There needed to be 400 teams. There weren't a bunch of lights. It was set up a floor. We would go to events that were at high schools and where we were paying $100 per team to get into the event, as opposed to $190 per athlete to get into the event. So I think there were pros and cons to that. I definitely think that it shifted once private equity started to get involved. And that's where I think there was some significant issue. And I don't think private equity being involved in these things has been good, really good for the sport. I think it's good from a financial perspective to get, it obviously added more money to the sport and gave the ability to, I don't think we would have ever gotten the venue that we have at Disney if it weren't for private equity being involved and those kind of relationships and deals going on. But then you could argue, was it good for us to have a venue at Disney World? I mean, I don't know. I think so. I think it's pretty cool. It definitely helps with the legitimacy of what we do, but it certainly sucks for people like me who are on the West Coast who have to go to Florida 3 times a year for competitions. Like, it's crazy. So overall, I don't love the private equity involvement in the sport. I think that it just made it definitely a profits over people perspective. And I think that gets away from what is so valuable about our sport, which kind of takes me to my last thing to talk about with this, because I could ramble on. And this was a really long article. I'm not here to defend anyone. I'm just here to give my opinion of it. I think that they obviously reported a lot of facts, and you can pull from those facts what you want. A lot of it was not a surprise to me. There were some things that I didn't know. There were certainly some direct quotes in there from people to other people saying, yeah, they said this exact thing to me. I did think that the interview that they sat down and conducted with Jeff Webb was very interesting. I liked hearing that perspective because I've never met him. I've never talked to him in person. The thing I didn't like about this article is ultimately this article painted cheerleading in a relatively negative way. And I hate that. Like, the title is How Cheerleading Became So Acrobatic, Dangerous, and Popular. That's the title. And the context of the article was cheerleading is really dangerous. The coaches are awful to the athletes. The people who created the industry and turned it into an industry had ill intent and wanted money over everything and cared about no one. And it's very dangerous. It closes with this story that is certainly very sad, but is talking about these adult women now looking back on their time in the sport of cheer as almost like survivors of a really horrible thing. And although they may have endured something very horrible, and that may be their story, I certainly don't believe that that's everyone's story leaving cheerleading. And I think it is unfair to paint cheer with that broad brush stroke, because I know that what we do makes a huge difference in kids' lives. I know that this sport is so amazing because it provides a safe space for so many kids. Like, this is a sport that welcomes kids of every possible demographic. And I think that's one of the coolest things about this sport. It's also one of the only sports that is designed with teams in mind that are both co-ed, like truly co-ed, with men and women on the same team at the same time, performing on the mat in a group environment that is cohesive, that they're both performing. It's not like co-ed soccer team that's just randomly thrown together. Like, it is the only sport I know of that is truly has an element designed for this in a team environment. There's like pairs skating and there's things like that is designed for that in like a pair, but there isn't any other sport that does it as a team. And I think it's just so cool what we're able to accomplish. Like, this sport is unlike any other. One of the reasons it's so cool is there really isn't a bench. Everyone is important. People can fill multiple roles, multiple body types. You have people who would not be able to, you've got very short people to very tall people, and everyone brings their own thing to the table, whether they're super strong or super agile or super flexible. Like, we're able to utilize each individual athlete's skill sets differently in order to create this amazing routine. And I think that is one of the things that's so cool about cheer. It empowers athletes to get better, to challenge themselves, to face difficulty in a team environment and be able to highlight the things that they're good at and get better at the things that they're good at, while also challenging things that they're not good at, but continue to grow as individuals, face adversity, grow, and be stronger. And I think that is what cheerleading can do. And if cheerleading is done in the right environment, with the right coaches in the right gyms, which I think that the majority of gyms out there are trying to be. Now, it's very easy to sit back and go, well, I can point a finger at this one event, this anecdotal thing, or this singular gym, or this singular coach. It's very easy to point at those things and say there's bad people. Yep, there are bad people 100%. And it is the job of good people to root those people out and get them out of our industry. But I've traveled the country. I work with hundreds of gym owners through Next Generation Gym Owners Academy. I work with thousands of kids through Dream Camps. I get to meet coaches and kids from all across the country. And there are so many good people in it. There's so many. That's why I'm still here. That's why I continue to do this. There's a lot of ways to go out and make money and make a living. But this is where I've chosen to be. And that's why. It's because it's so impactful. It's so amazing what we get the opportunity to do. And I just want people to take that away. And I felt that was a missed opportunity, that there wasn't that alternative perspective in this article. Now, I get it was already a very long article, so they didn't have time to go into that. And there is certainly more than enough skeletons to drag out of the closet over the last, I mean, they started way back in the early 80s and before that talking about cheerleading. So there's a lot of time to pull up some skeletons and some things that have gone on that were not above board. But I really, really think that although there were some important things brought to light by this article, there is also some things that were missed. So where do I think we're going? I think the cheer industry is actually headed in the right direction. I think that we are seeing a reset. We're seeing more and more independent event producers. We're seeing people being held accountable for behaviors. We're seeing people less tolerant of those kind of behaviors. It referenced, the frat party era of cheer. And I was here for that. And I was always shocked by what was considered appropriate when I was early on in my gym owner career. I think that we've kind of recalibrated, and I think that's really good. And you've seen the people who've stayed in the industry for a long time, who maybe were in those eras, who are making changes. And I think that is an important thing that we're doing. And I am really excited and optimistic about the industry. Now, my biggest concern is obviously pricing, but I think, again, having independent event producers, having different camp providers, different choreography providers, different uniform providers, like all of that, having competition in the marketplace is good. And that, I think, is something they talked about in the article as a bad thing, but we've already started to see a recalibration. Now, is it hard to beat Varsity? Yes. I'm technically a competitor of Varsity with my camp company, and it's hard. It's hard to compete. It is hard to compete with the thing that everyone knows, and every single coach, went to a varsity camp when they were an athlete. So that's what they automatically think of. So it's hard to get your brand out there. It's hard to compete, but it's possible. And we've seen tons of brands do it. Tons of disruptors come in there, whether it be the Open Championship coming in on the competitive side, or companies like Rebel or GK on the uniform side, or Infinity on the shoe side. We've seen industry disruptors who've come in and and shaken things up even after this so-called monopoly. Well, I mean, not even so-called. I mean, they've made settlements in regard to monopolistic claims. This monopolistic style that Varsity kind of achieved at one point. And do they still control the lion's share of the market? Yeah, I mean, I think they do. But again, I think we're seeing a lot of positive shift. And I think we've seen some positive shift since competitors have come back in the market where Varsity is starting to get more competitive. And I like that. I like them being pushed to look at their pricing and maybe not increase it as much. And so I'm very optimistic about the future. And I think we all should be too. My last kind of challenge to you is, as you leave this episode, be the change you want to see. It's really easy to go on Facebook and repost these things and talk a lot of smack and say, I can't believe these things happened, and live in the past. Well, the past has already happened. Now we're here. I tell this story all the time. My kids don't get it. I worked with an officer. He had two sayings he would say he had a number of sayings he would say, but a couple. One would always be like, at the end of the night, he'd be like, well, Cotton, we lived another day. And that was like his good night. And then the other one would be, this is one of those moments where you got to ask yourself, what would John Wayne do? And then he'd pause for dramatic effect and he'd say, and then you realize John Wayne's not going to do anything. John Wayne's dead. It's up to us. I kind of like that. Like, look, it's up to us. We determine the future of our sport. We determine where our money gets spent. We determine who we choose to support as an industry. I encourage you to vote with your dollar and be the change you want to see in the industry. If you want to see athletes being safe, if you want to see athletes being treated with care, if you want to see athletes leaving the sport thankful for their time in it, then be the change you want to see. We can do it, but it's going to take parents, coaches, athletes, event producers, providers. We all need to hold ourselves to a higher standard. And I believe if we do that, we will see an improvement in the industry as a whole. All right, everyone. I want to thank you for listening. Thank you for joining. And with that, we'll catch you on the next episode.